Diogenes of Sinope, the man who mastered freedom. In this documentary, we will break down one of the most extraordinary, provocative, and genuinely dangerous philosophers who ever lived. Diogenes of Sinope, a man who made his home in a large ceramic jar, who ate scraps in public, who told Alexander the Great to get out of his sunlight, who carried a lamp through the streets in broad daylight, claiming to search for an honest man, who insulted Plato to his face and made the insult into a philosophical argument. This was not a madman or a fool. This was a philosopher whose every act was a calculated argument, whose outrageous behavior was a systematic philosophical demonstration, and whose ideas about nature, virtue, freedom, and society cut deeper than almost anyone in the ancient world. He was not a system builder in the style of Plato or Aristotle. He wrote almost nothing that survived, and what little he may have written was dismissed even in his own lifetime as unworthy of serious consideration. He built no school in the architectural sense, held no formal position, accumulated no property, sought no patron, held no political office, and died in obscurity or in glory depending on whose account you read. Yet his influence reached across centuries, shaped an entire philosophical tradition that lasted 500 years, seduced some of the greatest minds of the ancient world, and continues to unsettle comfortable assumptions about how human beings should live. What Diogenes created was not a system of propositions, but a way of being. His philosophy was embodied rather than written, performed rather than argued, lived rather than taught. Every aspect of his daily existence, what he ate, how he dressed, where he slept, how he addressed the powerful and the famous, how he responded to insult and to flattery, was a philosophical statement. He made his body into an argument. He turned his life into a demonstration. And the demonstration was this: that virtue alone is sufficient for happiness, that everything society calls valuable is worthless, that natural life requires almost nothing, and that freedom is available to anyone with the courage to take it. His biography is as much legend as fact, which is itself philosophically fitting. A philosopher who challenged the distinction between appearance and reality, who insisted that what we call civilization is merely convention and pretense, leaves behind exactly the kind of record you would expect. Stories, paradoxes, memorable exchanges, jokes at the expense of the mighty, and a reputation so vivid it survived the loss of nearly everything he actually said or did. What survives is enough. In some ways, it is more than enough. What you are about to encounter is a philosophy of radical freedom and radical honesty that strips away every pretense, every comfortable assumption, every social convention masquerading as natural law. It is not a comfortable philosophy. It was never meant to be. It is a philosophy that takes seriously a question most people spend their entire lives avoiding. What do you actually need in order to live well? And what are you carrying that you could put down right now? Diogenes answered that question with his whole life, and with the cheerful ferocity of a man who had nothing to lose because he had already given everything away. Whether you are trying to understand where genuine human freedom comes from, seeking to think more clearly about what you actually need versus what you have been trained to want, curious about the philosophical foundations of a life lived without pretense, or simply wanting to understand one of the strangest and most consequential figures in the history of thought, Diogenes' complete philosophy provides the map. Not a utopian fantasy, but something far more unsettling, a careful, honest, relentlessly argued interrogation of every assumption you carry about what makes a life worth living. The philosophy of Diogenes is not something you read and then set aside. It is something you read and then find yourself unable to stop applying, unable to stop asking the questions it plants in you, unable to look at the comfortable arrangements of your own life without wondering which of them are genuinely necessary and which are performances you have been giving so long you have forgotten they are performances. That is what genuine philosophy does. That is what Diogenes was doing, and that is what we are going to explore. Part 1. The Foundation. Exile and the Birth of a Philosopher. Philosophy often begins in comfort and leisure, in the academies and gardens of the prosperous. Diogenes' philosophy began in catastrophe and disgrace. Understanding where he started is essential for understanding what he built from the ruins, because his philosophy was not invented in safety. It was extracted from ruin, forged in the experience of losing everything that his world said mattered, and tested against the reality of actually living without those things. He was born in Sinope, a prosperous Greek colony on the Black Sea coast, in what is now northern Turkey, around 412 BCE. His father Hysiseus appears to have been a banker or money changer, a respectable and reasonably prosperous figure in a prosperous city. Sinope was a significant trading port, part of the wider Greek colonial world that stretched across the Mediterranean and Black Sea coasts. It was a city of commerce, of civic pride, of the ordinary, competitive status-seeking that characterized Greek urban life. Diogenes grew up in comfort, in a civic culture that prized reputation, property, family standing, and the ordinary markers of a successful life. He had everything that most people in the ancient world would have recognized as the prerequisites of the good life. Then came the coin scandal. The stories differ in their details but agree on the core. Diogenes was implicated in the adulteration or counterfeiting of coins. Some accounts say his father was the primary criminal, and Diogenes was involved peripherally, or perhaps only by association. Others say Diogenes himself was the instigator, and his father was the instrument. The oracle at Delphi, according to one famous story, had told Diogenes to deface the currency, an instruction he initially interpreted literally before understanding it as a command to challenge and deface the currency of conventional values. Whether this oracular story is true or a later invention, designed to give philosophical meaning to a crime, the result was the same. Diogenes was exiled from Sinope. He lost his home, his standing, his property, his family connections, his civic identity, and everything that had constituted his position in the world. Everything that had made him who he was, in the terms his culture recognized, was taken from him or abandoned. He eventually made his way to Athens, which was at that time the philosophical capital of the ancient world, home to Plato's academy, to Aristotle's developing thought, to the most vigorous intellectual debate happening anywhere on earth. Diogenes arrived not as a student seeking admission to the great schools, but as a displaced, propertyless wanderer, with apparently nothing. What he built from nothing was a philosophy. What he turned his catastrophe into was a system of thought so radical that it made the catastrophe look, in retrospect, like a liberation. The transformation he underwent, or performed, was this. He took every loss as a discovery. He had lost his wealth. He discovered that wealth was not necessary. He had lost his civic status. He discovered that civic status was a fiction. He had lost his home. He discovered that shelter was available everywhere and to everyone. He had lost his reputation. He discovered that conventional reputation was precisely what needed to be destroyed. Each thing taken away turned out, in his reframing, to be a thing he was better off without. This is either the deepest philosophical wisdom or the most elaborate self-consolation ever constructed. It may genuinely be both, and the fact that it may be both does not make it less true or less useful. What matters philosophically is that Diogenes took his exile seriously as a philosophical situation, rather than simply as a misfortune to be survived. He did not spend his years in Athens mourning Sinope or scheming for rehabilitation. He spent them developing, with radical consistency, the implications of his new condition. If you have nothing, what do you actually need? If you belong nowhere, where do you actually belong? If society has rejected you, what does society actually owe you, and what do you owe it? These questions, pressed with absolute seriousness and answered with absolute honesty, produced a philosophy unlike anything that came before it, and unlike anything that has been attempted with quite the same thoroughness since. The oracle's instruction, deface the currency, became the master metaphor of his life's work. Every convention he violated, every social norm he flouted, every expectation he confounded, was an act of defacing the false currency of conventional values. He was revaluing everything from the ground up, melting down the coins of social life and assaying their actual gold content, which he consistently found to be much less than advertised. The counterfeiter of Sinope became the assayer of Athens, and what he found when he tested the values of his world was that most of them were base metal, stamped to look like gold. This starting point, the man who has lost everything and discovered that almost nothing was lost, is the biographical foundation of everything Diogenes argued and demonstrated. It is important not to treat it as mere biographical colour, as an interesting backstory that can be set aside when we get to the real philosophy. It is the real philosophy, or at least its generative core. His arguments were not the products of abstract reasoning conducted in comfort. They were the products of a man who had actually lived without the things that conventional wisdom insisted were necessary for happiness, and who had found, against all expectation, that he was happier without them. Part 2. The Teacher, Antisthenes and the Cynical Inheritance. No philosopher is created entirely from nothing, and Diogenes, for all his apparent originality, stood in a philosophical tradition and was shaped by a specific teacher whose influence deserves careful examination. That teacher was Antisthenes of Athens, and understanding what Antisthenes taught helps explain both what Diogenes inherited and how dramatically he transformed it. Antisthenes had himself been a student of Socrates, and the Socratic influence runs deep in everything that cynicism would become. From Socrates, Antisthenes took the commitment to virtue as the highest human good, the insistence that virtue consists in a certain kind of knowledge and character, rather than in external possessions or social position, the willingness to engage anyone anywhere in philosophical conversation without regard to their status, and the relentless questioning of assumptions that others treated as self-evident. He also took something else from Socrates: the willingness to live in ways that seemed eccentric, even offensive, to conventional Athenians in pursuit of philosophical truth, and the conviction that how you lived was a philosophical statement as much as what you said. Antisthenes was a rigorous and serious thinker who developed his own philosophical positions on logic, language, and virtue that were respected by serious philosophers including Plato, however much Plato disagreed with him. His key philosophical contribution was the insistence that virtue is the only genuine good, that external things, wealth, health, beauty, social standing, pleasure, are neither good nor bad in themselves but morally indifferent. What matters, what genuinely determines whether your life goes well or badly, is the state of your soul, your character, your will, and these things are entirely within your own control regardless of what fortune does to everything outside you. This was a powerful and demanding idea. It meant that the virtuous person could not be harmed in the way that mattered most, because what mattered most was beyond fortune's reach. When Diogenes appeared in Athens seeking philosophical instruction, the story goes that Antisthenes initially tried to drive him away, beating him with his staff to discourage his persistence. Diogenes reportedly said, "Strike, for you will find no wood hard enough to drive me away while you have anything to say." Whether this exchange is historical or invented, it captures something real about the relationship. Diogenes was not a passive receiver of a philosophical tradition. He was a forceful, demanding, and ultimately transformative student who took what his teacher offered and radicalized it beyond anything Antisthenes intended or perhaps desired. What Diogenes did to the Antisthenic inheritance was push it past every point of comfort, past every place where the argument could have been stopped and a more socially acceptable version preserved. Antisthenes had said, "Virtue is sufficient for happiness, and externals are indifferent." Diogenes took this seriously enough to actually live without externals, not just to argue that they were dispensable in theory. Antisthenes had criticized the pretensions of the wealthy and powerful. Diogenes insulted them to their faces in public with cheerful and systematic regularity. Antisthenes had argued for simplicity in living. Diogenes lived in a jar, owned a cloak and a cup, and when he saw a child drinking from cupped hands, threw away even the cup. The teacher had the theory. The student became the demonstration. This difference between holding a position and embodying it is the central difference between Antisthenes and Diogenes, and it is the difference that made Diogenes historically consequential in a way that Antisthenes, for all his philosophical rigor, never quite was. The name cynic, from the Greek word for dog, attached itself to this philosophical tradition at some point in its development, possibly as an insult launched by critics who were offended by the cynic's apparent willingness to live like animals, to perform bodily functions without shame, to reject the social graces that distinguished civilized human beings from beasts. Diogenes and his followers embraced the insult and transformed it into a philosophical emblem. He was called the dog, and he accepted the title gladly, arguing at length and with genuine philosophical seriousness that the dog's life was superior to the human life most people actually lived. Dogs are honest. They do not pretend to like what they dislike or to respect what they do not respect. Dogs are unsentimental. They do not accumulate possessions they do not need or maintain relationships that serve no genuine purpose. Dogs are direct. They respond to what is actually before them, rather than to the social meanings layered over it. Dogs do everything in public, without shame, because they have not internalized the social constructions that make certain natural acts unacceptable to perform where others can see. In accepting the label of dog, Diogenes was making the argument that the supposed distinction between civilized human life and animal life was not the unambiguous mark of progress that his culture assumed it was. Part 3. The Method. Philosophy as Performance. To understand Diogenes' philosophy, you have to understand his method, and his method was unlike any other philosophers in the ancient world. He did not write systematic treatises. He did not conduct formal seminars. He did not argue through lengthy chains of deductive reasoning in the manner of Aristotle, or develop elaborate epistemological frameworks in the manner of Plato. His method was performance. His instrument was his life. And the decision to make performance his primary philosophical method was itself a philosophical position of the deepest importance. Consider what it means to choose performance over argument as your philosophical method. Argument proceeds through language, through the assembly of propositions, through the logical relationships between claims. It can be written down, copied, transmitted, disputed, refined. It addresses the reader's or listener's reason directly, asking them to follow a chain of inference and accept a conclusion if the reasoning holds. Performance is different. It addresses the whole person, their senses, their social instincts, their emotional responses, their sense of what is appropriate and what is transgressive. It forces a reaction before it allows a reflection. It creates an experience rather than merely conveying information. And it has a staying power that pure argument often lacks, because experiences are remembered in ways that chains of reasoning are not. Every action Diogenes performed in public was a philosophical argument in compressed form, a demonstration designed to force observers into a moment of genuine philosophical engagement they could not easily evade. When he walked through Athens with a lit lamp in daylight, announcing that he was searching for an honest man, he was not being whimsical or seeking attention for its own sake. He was making a serious philosophical point about the rarity of genuine honesty in human affairs and the almost willful blindness of people who live among universal pretense without noticing it. The image was vivid, memorable, and irrefutable in the way that demonstrations are irrefutable. You cannot argue with a lamp in daylight the way you can argue with a philosophical proposition. You can only understand what it means, and once you understand it, you cannot easily pretend you have not understood it. When he was asked why he ate in the marketplace, a serious social transgression in a culture that kept eating private and domestic, he said that the marketplace was where he felt hungry, so naturally that was where he ate. The argument embedded in this simple act is a reductio ad absurdum of the artificial separation between public and private life, between what is acceptable to do and what is acceptable to be seen doing. If eating is acceptable, why is being seen eating unacceptable? What is the principle that generates that distinction? If you press on the principle, you find that it has no natural basis. It is a social convention about where certain activities belong, maintained by social pressure and enforced by shame. And if the principle has no natural basis, then violating it is not doing anything genuinely wrong. It is only violating a convention. And violating a convention is, for Diogenes, not a transgression, but a demonstration. When he satisfied his bodily needs, in public, which he did deliberately and repeatedly, he was making the same kind of point with maximum provocation and maximum clarity. If the act is natural and harmless, the prohibition against performing it publicly must be a social convention. And social convention, Diogenes insisted, is not natural law. It is an agreement among people who have decided, for various reasons, mostly traceable to shame and pretense, that certain natural things should be hidden. He refused to hide natural things. The refusal was the argument. And the argument was that the hiding, the performance of modesty around natural functions, was a symptom of the wider disease, the human tendency to dress up nature in social costume until nobody can remember what nature actually looks like underneath. The economy of this method was extraordinary. A single act, performed in the right place at the right time before the right audience, could accomplish what a lengthy philosophical treatise could never accomplish. It could make people feel the argument before they could construct a defense against it. It could force a question that comfortable reasoning could always find ways to evade. It could penetrate the layers of social conditioning that make people immune to abstract arguments about the arbitrariness of conventions they have internalized so deeply that they no longer experience them as conventions at all. They experience them as reality, as nature, as simply how things are. The performance was a crowbar applied to that experience, forcing open the gap between what people felt to be natural and what was actually natural. Diogenes was also a master of the devastating verbal rejoinder, the single-sentence demolition of a pretension or an argument that left nothing standing. His exchanges with Alexander the Great, with Plato, with politicians and sophists and prominent citizens became legendary precisely because of their compression. Each rejoinder was a philosophical argument with everything non-essential stripped away, leaving only the essential cut. When asked what country he was from, he said, "I am a citizen of the world." In 5 words, he challenged the entire structure of political identity and civic loyalty that organized his society. When Plato defined man as a featherless biped, Diogenes produced a plucked chicken and said, "Here is Plato's man." In one gesture, he demonstrated that an abstract definition, no matter how carefully worded, could be satisfied by something completely unlike what the definition was meant to describe, exposing the inadequacy of mere definition as a philosophical method. When someone told him he had been made fun of in his absence, he replied, "But I am not absent." In 4 words, He made the point that philosophical identity is not located in the body, that his presence as a philosopher and as a provocation was not diminished by the fact that his physical body was elsewhere. The method of philosophical performance was not original to Diogenes. Socrates had practiced something similar in the streets and gymnasia of Athens, using conversation and questioning to expose the ignorance of those who thought they knew what virtue, justice, and piety were. But Diogenes extended the method further than Socrates had gone, in ways that were more extreme, more deliberately provocative, and less protected by the social conventions of polite philosophical discourse. Socrates asked questions. Diogenes performed answers. Socrates expressed ignorance and confusion. Diogenes displayed certainty and clarity. Socrates operated within the limits of social convention, even while questioning it, maintaining the forms of polite discourse, even when his content was deeply unsettling. Diogenes violated social convention openly and without apology, using the violation itself as part of the philosophical message. The student of Antisthenes had learned from the tradition that ran back to Socrates, and then he had taken it somewhere none of them had been willing to go. Understanding the method is essential for understanding the content. Diogenes' philosophy cannot be fully grasped by reading a list of his positions, because the positions were inseparable from the manner of their demonstration. The argument that bodily functions are natural and nothing to be ashamed of was not just a proposition to be evaluated on abstract grounds. It was a lived demonstration that created a visceral experience of the argument in everyone who witnessed it. The argument that freedom from dependence produces genuine happiness was not just a theoretical claim. It was embodied in a man who actually had no dependencies and who appeared, by every account, to be genuinely happy. The philosophy was life. The life was philosophy. Separating them is like trying to understand a painting by reading a description of it. Part 4. Nature against convention. The central argument. At the heart of everything Diogenes did and said lay a single, powerful philosophical distinction: the distinction between nature and convention. This was not an obscure technical distinction. It was the master key to his entire philosophy, the blade with which he cut through every pretension and every unjustified authority. Understanding it deeply, not just as an intellectual position but as a live philosophical tool, is the most important task in understanding Diogenes. Convention, in his understanding, is what human communities have agreed to treat as important, valuable, or obligatory. The crucial word is agreed. Conventions are not discovered. They are made. They arise from the practices, decisions, and accumulated habits of communities over time, and they are maintained by social pressure, by the emotional mechanisms of shame and approval, and by the sheer inertia of familiarity. Wealth is conventional. There is nothing in nature that makes gold inherently valuable. Its value is entirely a function of the agreement among people to treat it as valuable. And that agreement, however ancient and however universal within a given culture, is agreement rather than nature. Social status is conventional. There is nothing in nature that makes the son of a nobleman superior to the son of a slave. The hierarchy of social standing is a human construction, maintained by the people at the top and accepted or endured by the people at the bottom. Property laws are conventional. There is nothing in nature that establishes a boundary between what is mine and what is yours. The elaborate legal and social structures that define and protect property are human inventions, relatively recent in the history of the species, and their content varies enormously across cultures and periods. Modesty norms are conventional. There is nothing in nature that makes it shameful to perform bodily functions in public. The division between what may be done publicly and what must be hidden is a social construction, and its content varies just as much across cultures and times as any other convention. Nature, by contrast, is what remains when you strip away everything conventional. What does a human animal actually need? Food, water, shelter from extreme weather, some degree of warmth and physical safety. What does a human animal actually desire, in the deepest sense? The sense that these desires arise from what we are, rather than from what we have been taught to want. Company, movement, intellectual engagement, the satisfaction of bodily needs, the experience of beauty and pleasure in their simplest forms. What does a human animal actually fear? Pain and death. Everything else, the elaborate superstructure of social life with its status markers and wealth-seeking and reputation management and political ambition and fashion and propriety, is convention, and convention is, in Diogenes' consistent judgment, a trap that has captured almost everyone. The trap works with a mechanism that is worth describing precisely. Conventions create artificial needs. Once you accept that a certain level of wealth is required for a respectable life, you have created a need that nature never imposed on you. You now must work to satisfy that need, and the work requires compromise, dependence on the goodwill of others, the suppression of inconvenient truths, and the endless anxiety of wondering whether you are doing enough to maintain your position. Once you accept that social status is genuinely important, you must spend enormous energy maintaining it. You become vulnerable to losing it at any moment, through a bad business decision, a social misstep, the caprice of the powerful, or the simple bad luck that fortune distributes without regard for merit. This vulnerability makes you anxious. The anxiety makes you cautious. The caution makes you dishonest, because honest speech is dangerous to the person whose position depends on the goodwill of others. And dishonesty is not just an external performance, but an internalized habit that eventually corrupts your relationship with your own thoughts and perceptions. You become a person who no longer trusts your own judgments because you have trained yourself over years of social performance to filter every judgment through the question of what you are supposed to think rather than what you actually see. This is the deepest form of the trap. It is not just that convention enslaves you to external things. It is that convention eventually corrupts your inner life, your relationship with your own perceptions and judgments. The person who has fully internalized the conventions of their society does not experience those conventions as external constraints. They experience them as reality itself. They genuinely believe that wealth is important because they have never had the experience of doing without it and discovering that the deprivation was survivable. They genuinely believe that social status matters because they have never tested the experience of losing it and finding that they were still themselves, still capable of pleasure and thought and honest perception on the other side of the loss. Diogenes had had exactly that experience. He had been a man of property and standing in Sinope. He had lost everything, and in losing everything he had discovered that what he had lost was not valuable in the way he had thought. The needs his conventional life had required him to satisfy turned out, when he no longer had the means to satisfy them, to be artificial needs. His actual needs, for food, shelter, intellectual engagement, the opportunity to say what he thought to anyone who would listen, could be met at minimal cost. The elaborate social performance that had constituted his former life turned out to have been optional all along. He had been carrying a weight he did not have to carry. The exile that his contemporaries would have regarded as the worst possible fate, loss of home, property, status, and civic identity, turned out, in his experience, to be a liberation from the burden of pretending that those things were worth having at the cost they required. This is the biographical root of the philosophical argument. The argument from nature against convention is not a thought experiment conducted in safety. It is a report from someone who actually tried, living without the conventional goods, and found, against all expectation, that it worked. This does not make the argument irrefutable, but it gives it a kind of authority that purely theoretical arguments lack. Diogenes was not saying that wealth and status are unnecessary from behind the walls of a comfortable house. He was saying it from inside a jar. The positive content of the argument is as important as the critical content. What Diogenes was not saying is that life without conventions is necessarily better in every respect, or that the natural life is simple or easy. What he was saying is that if you attend carefully to the distinction between what is genuinely natural and what is merely conventional, you will find that you can live well on far less than you think, that the things you are most afraid of losing are less important than your fear of losing them, suggests, and that the freedom you gain by reducing your dependence on conventional goods is a freedom that cannot be taken from you by any reversal of fortune. The argument also has a specific application to honesty that deserves separate attention. The person who depends on conventional goods, on wealth, status, the goodwill of the powerful, is structurally compromised in their capacity for honesty. They cannot say what they see if what they see would damage their position. They cannot tell the powerful what the powerful need to hear if what they need to hear would anger those who control access to the conventional goods on which the philosopher depends. The only person capable of genuine honesty is the person who has nothing to lose. Diogenes' poverty and homelessness were not incidental features of his life that he happened to endure. They were the preconditions of his philosophical mission, which was to be the person who said what everyone could see but nobody with anything to lose was willing to say out loud. This argument, that genuine philosophical freedom requires material simplicity as its precondition, is one of the most challenging ideas in Diogenes' philosophy, and it is one that later philosophical traditions largely refuse to follow. The Stoics took the cynical insight about the indifference of external goods and domesticated it, arguing that you could maintain philosophical freedom while living a conventional life of wealth and status, provided you were inwardly detached from those things. Diogenes would have regarded this as precisely the kind of comfortable self-deception that his philosophy was designed to expose. Inner detachment that does not express itself in actual behavior is not detachment. It is the philosophical equivalent of the coin scandal, a surface that looks like the real thing and is not. Part 5. The self-sufficient life, autarky and freedom. The positive content of Diogenes' philosophy, what he was for, not just what he was against, can be captured in a single Greek word: autarkia, self-sufficiency. The good life, in his understanding, is the self-sufficient life. The free person is the person who needs as little from others as possible, who has reduced their dependence on the generosity, approval, and continued goodwill of other people to the absolute minimum that nature requires. Everything else, the elaborate structures of social and economic interdependence that conventional life requires, is a form of bondage, however voluntarily entered into and however comfortable it may feel from the inside. It is important to understand what autarky meant for Diogenes and what it did not mean. It did not mean hermetic isolation, complete withdrawal from human contact. Diogenes lived in the middle of Athens, the most populated and most socially active city in the Greek world. He engaged with people constantly, in the agora, in the streets, at the entrances to athletic facilities, at public gatherings. He sought out conversation, argument, philosophical engagement with anyone willing to provide it. His was not a philosophy of social withdrawal. It was a philosophy of social engagement on his own terms, unconditioned by the social obligations and dependencies that normally structure human interaction. What autarky meant, for Diogenes, was that his engagement with others was genuinely voluntary and unconstrained, in a way that most people's engagement was not. When you need something from someone, their money, their approval, their patronage, their protection, your engagement with them is not fully free. It is shaped by the need. You manage the relationship, you present yourself in certain ways, you suppress certain truths and emphasize certain others in order to protect access to what you need. Diogenes needed nothing from anyone. His engagement was therefore entirely unconstrained. He could say exactly what he thought to whoever he was talking to, because there was nothing they could take from him, and nothing they could offer him that would make a material difference to his life. This freedom of expression was not a personality trait or a social manner. It was a philosophical achievement, made possible by the material conditions of his life. Autarky was not merely a personal preference for Diogenes. It was a philosophical achievement that required deliberate cultivation, systematic practice, and the willingness to endure real discomfort in pursuit of a freedom that most people had never experienced, and therefore could not even imagine desiring. You do not become self-sufficient simply by deciding that wealth and status do not matter. You become self-sufficient by actively training yourself to need less, to endure more, to take genuine pleasure in what is freely available rather than in what must be purchased or competed for or maintained through social performance. This training, the Greek word askesis, which gives us our word asceticism, was central to the Cynic way of life and constituted what Diogenes regarded as the real work of philosophy. He trained his capacity for endurance by exposing himself to physical hardship voluntarily and systematically. He rolled his jar across the hot sand in summer, deliberately, seeking the discomfort of heat. He embraced a cold bronze statue in winter, training his body to endure cold without distress. He ate the simplest and cheapest foods, raw vegetables, legumes, whatever was available cheaply or freely, and trained his palate and his appetite to find genuine satisfaction in them. He slept outside or in public spaces, training his body to rest without the artificial comfort of a proper bed. He wore a single coarse cloak as his only garment in all seasons, training his body to endure temperature variations that a person accustomed to proper clothing would find intolerable. The logic of this training program is clearer when you think about what it was achieving. Each discomfort that Diogenes trained himself to endure was a discomfort that no longer had power over him. Each artificial pleasure he trained himself to not need was a dependency he had eliminated. The person who cannot endure cold is controlled by cold. They must arrange their life to avoid it, must spend resources on protection against it, must organize their movements and their shelter around the necessity of keeping warm. The person who can endure cold has eliminated that constraint. They are free from cold in a way that the person who depends on warmth is not. Multiply this across the full range of physical and social dependencies, and you can begin to see the scope of the freedom that Diogenes was cultivating. He was systematically eliminating, one by one, every lever that fortune and other people could use to control him. He extended this logic into an explicit critique of athletic culture, which was one of the most prestigious institutions in ancient Greek life. The great athletes of the ancient world trained with extraordinary discipline and endured enormous physical hardship in the service of their craft. Diogenes admired the discipline while questioning the purpose. Athletic training developed physical capacity in service of winning social approval, the garland, the fame, the admiration of the crowd, the honor to the athlete's city. All of that was conventional reward, not natural good. The philosopher who trained with equal discipline to become genuinely self-sufficient, to maintain equanimity under any conditions, to preserve their capacity for honest thought and honest speech, regardless of what fortune brought. This person was developing something of genuinely enduring value. Their achievement would not be eroded by age and injury the way athletic achievement was. Their training would remain useful in the situation that mattered most. The situation in which fortune turned against you, in which the comfortable arrangements of ordinary life fell apart, in which the person who had cultivated genuine autarky would discover that they had resources that the conventionally successful person entirely lacked. The self-sufficient life was also, for Diogenes, a life freed from two of the most powerful and most destructive human motivations: the desire for social approval and the fear of social disapproval. These motivations, far more than any explicit philosophical commitment, drive the actual behavior of most human beings. They drive the accumulation of wealth beyond what is genuinely needed. They drive the maintenance of social performances that have nothing to do with genuine virtue and everything to do with managing other people's perceptions. They drive the telling of comfortable lies rather than uncomfortable truths. They drive the suppression of natural impulses, natural thoughts, and natural expressions of self in deference to social norms that serve nobody's genuine interests. The person who has genuinely trained themselves into autarky has liberated themselves from both these motivations. They do not need approval. They do not fear disapproval. They are, in the most radical and thoroughgoing sense, free. Part 6. The Dog's Life: Shamelessness as Philosophy. The aspect of Diogenes' philosophy that most scandalized his contemporaries, and that still has the power to unsettle even philosophically sophisticated readers, was his systematic practice of what the Greeks called anaideia, shamelessness. This was not merely a character trait, not simply the boldness of a man unusually indifferent to public opinion. It was a philosophical position, carefully argued and deliberately practiced, and understanding it properly requires understanding the philosophical function that shame serves in human social life. Shame is the primary emotional mechanism by which societies enforce conformity. It works not through physical coercion, laws and their enforcement do that, but through the internalization of social judgment. When you feel shame, you are not experiencing an external force. You are experiencing the pressure of the community standards as something you have made your own, something you feel as coming from inside you rather than from outside. This is what makes shame such a powerful instrument of social control. It does not require a policeman. It does not require a court or a prison. It operates automatically, continuously, invisibly, through the very structure of the social self, which is constructed in large part through the experience of social approval and disapproval over a lifetime. Shame keeps people in line. It enforces conformity with extraordinary effectiveness. It punishes those who deviate from the expectations of the group with a form of suffering that is both immediate and difficult to argue with, because the suffering does not feel like the imposition of an external judgment. It feels like the recognition of a genuine fault, like the appropriate response to having done something that really is wrong. This phenomenology of shame, the way it presents itself as a response to genuine wrongdoing rather than as the internalized pressure of social convention, is exactly what makes it such an effective mechanism of control and exactly what Diogenes was targeting. His argument was this: much of what we feel ashamed of is not genuinely shameful. The shame is the emotional residue of conventions that have no natural basis and serve purposes that are not genuinely related to human flourishing. You feel shame at eating in public, not because eating in public is genuinely wrong, but because your society has decided that eating is a private activity and has enforced that decision through the mechanism of shame. You feel shame at poverty not because poverty is a genuine moral failing, but because your society treats poverty as a sign of inadequacy or failure and enforces that judgment through social contempt and its internalized correlate, shame. You feel shame at exposing your body not because your body is genuinely shameful, but because your society has constructed an elaborate set of norms about what may and may not be displayed, and enforced those norms through shame. If the shame is the residue of conventions that are themselves unjustified, then the Shame is itself unjustified, and if the shame is unjustified, it should be eliminated, just as any other form of unnecessary suffering should be eliminated. The path to its elimination is exactly what Diogenes practiced: the deliberate, repeated, public performance of actions that generate shame, done without apology and with philosophical clarity about why the shame is unwarranted, until the shame loses its grip. This is training in the precise sense that physical training is training, not the assertion of an idea, but the development of a capacity, through practice, to endure or surpass a limitation. The public dimension of his practice was philosophically essential. It was not enough to be shameless in private, behind closed doors where nobody was watching, because shame is a social phenomenon. It arises in the presence of real or imagined others. It can only be trained away by confronting it in its natural environment, which is the gaze of an actual community. Diogenes performed his most transgressive acts in the most public places available: the agora, the entrance to athletic facilities, crowded streets, because he was conducting his philosophical training in precisely the conditions under which shame had maximum force. And he was demonstrating to himself and to every observer that those conditions did not have the power over him that they had over everyone else. There is a genuine and important philosophical insight here that gets obscured by the most extreme of Diogenes' practices: the observation that much of what we feel ashamed of is not genuinely shameful, that social norms enforce conformity as much as they enforce genuine morality, that the fear of public disapproval leads people into dishonesty, cowardice, and the suppression of their actual natures. This observation is correct, important, and largely neglected by more comfortable philosophical traditions. Most philosophical systems accept the emotional architecture of shame more or less as they find it, and try to redirect it toward genuinely shameful things. Diogenes questioned the architecture itself, asking not just what we should be ashamed of, but whether shame, as a mechanism of social control, deserves the philosophical authority that ordinary social life assigns to it. The answer he gave was carefully qualified, even if his practice seemed unqualified. He was not arguing that nothing is genuinely shameful. He was arguing that the shame mechanism, as it operates in actual human communities, is systematically misdirected, pointed at violations of convention rather than at violations of nature, at departures from social norms rather than at genuine moral failures. The genuinely shameful things, in his view, were the things that involved real harm to others or genuine failure of virtue: cowardice, dishonesty, cruelty, the surrender of your freedom to the opinions of others. These were worth being ashamed of. The natural functions of the body, the simple satisfaction of genuine needs, the display of what you actually are rather than the performance of what society wants you to appear to be. These were not worth being ashamed of, and the shame they generated was something to be trained away rather than honoured. Part 7. Cosmopolitanism, Citizenship of the World. Among Diogenes' contributions to the history of ideas, one stands out for its historical importance, its intellectual originality, and its continuing relevance to the deepest questions of political philosophy: his articulation of cosmopolitanism, the idea that every human being is, by virtue of their humanity alone, a citizen of the world, and not merely of any particular city, nation, or community. When asked where he was from, a question that in the ancient world carried enormous weight because civic identity was the foundation of legal status, social standing, and political rights, he gave the answer that has echoed through more than 2,000 years of philosophical discussion. I am a cosmopolite, a citizen of the cosmos, a citizen of the world. He was almost certainly the first person on record to use this phrase, and the idea it expressed was genuinely revolutionary in a world organized entirely around the I, assumption that political identity was necessarily local, particular, and exclusive. To claim citizenship of the world was not just to make a personal statement about where you felt at home. It was to challenge the entire conceptual framework within which political identity was understood. In 5th and 4th century Greece, political identity was intensely and exclusively local. You were an Athenian or a Spartan or a Corinthian. Your political rights, your social standing, your legal protections, your religious obligations, your sense of who was a fellow citizen and who was a foreigner, all of these were determined by and confined to your particular city-state. The distinction between citizen and non-citizen, between Greek and barbarian, structured every significant dimension of social and political life. To be without a city was to be without full legal and moral status. It was to be, in a profound sense, nobody, a person without the institutional and community framework within which personhood, as the ancient world understood it, was constituted. Diogenes' exile had deprived him of a city, and therefore, by conventional understanding, of a political identity. His response was not to seek a replacement city or to mourn his loss as a deprivation. It was to declare that the loss had revealed something important about the conventional understanding of political identity, that it was conventional all the way down, that the significance attached to particular civic membership was a product of agreement rather than of nature, and that a genuine understanding of what human beings actually are pointed toward a different and more universal form of political identity. His argument for cosmopolitanism followed directly from the central nature/convention distinction. If social conventions are arbitrary and the only genuine distinctions that matter are those of virtue and reason, then the distinction between Athenian and barbarian, between citizen and foreigner, has no more natural foundation than the distinction between rich and poor, or between high-born and low-born. All of these distinctions are conventional. They are maintained by social habit, enforced by social pressure, and perpetuated by the interest of those who benefit from them. The person who sees through the convention/nature distinction clearly cannot stop their analysis at the boundaries of their city-state. The same analytical blade that cuts through the pretensions of wealthy Athenians also cuts through the pretensions of Athens itself. What remains when you have cut through all the conventional distinctions is the human being, the creature capable of reason and virtue, capable of moral perception and philosophical reflection, capable of genuine fellowship with other creatures similarly equipped. This is the only distinction that Diogenes recognized as genuinely important, the distinction between those who live according to reason and nature and those who are enslaved to convention and appetite. And this distinction cuts across every conventional political boundary. There are people living according to reason and nature in Athens, in Persia, in Scythia, in every human community on earth. There are people enslaved to convention and appetite in every city and every culture. The cosmopolitan community, the only genuine political community in Diogenes' understanding, is the community of those who have achieved philosophical freedom, regardless of where they were born. The cosmopolitan idea was enormously influential on the Stoic philosophers who came after Diogenes, who developed it into a sophisticated political philosophy with practical implications for how the Roman Empire understood the relationship between its enormously diverse populations. The Stoic conception of natural law, a law binding on all rational beings regardless of their particular civic community, required exactly the kind of trans-political humanity that Diogenes had expressed in his claim to world citizenship. When Cicero argued that all human beings share a common nature and are therefore subject to common moral obligations regardless of their civic status, and when Marcus Aurelius meditated on his obligations to all of humanity rather than merely to Rome, they were drawing on a tradition that Diogenes had initiated with a biographical accident and a single devastating phrase. What Diogenes added to the cosmopolitan idea that purely theoretical accounts tend to miss is the lived demonstration of what it actually means to belong to no particular place. His homelessness was not just a condition he had been forced into and managed to endure. It was a philosophical position he maintained and elaborated deliberately. The person who belongs nowhere belongs everywhere. The person who has no particular tribal loyalty can encounter every human being without the filtering lens of tribal affiliation. They can see the Macedonian king and the Athenian slave and the Persian merchant as human beings rather than as representatives of categories, because they have no category of their own to defend and no tribal interest that would be served by emphasizing categorical distinctions. This is not merely theoretical freedom, it is a practical capacity for a kind of perception that tribally embedded persons find very difficult to achieve. Part 8. The encounter with Alexander, power and freedom. No episode in the life of Diogenes has done more to fix his image in the popular imagination than his encounter with Alexander the Great, and no episode more perfectly crystallizes the philosophical content of his life's work. The story has been told and retold for more than 2,000 years, in histories, in philosophical treatises, in paintings, in poems, and in popular culture of every era. It has accumulated layers of legendary elaboration over the centuries. Whether it occurred exactly as described is impossible to say with certainty. What is certain is that it expresses with perfect economy something essential about the philosophical position Diogenes occupied, and the challenge it posed to every conventional understanding of where power and freedom actually reside. Alexander of Macedon was, at the time of this encounter, either already the most powerful man in the known world or well on his way to becoming so. He had been educated by Aristotle, the most comprehensive and systematic philosopher of the ancient world, and he had absorbed from that education a genuine interest in philosophy and a genuine respect for philosophical achievement. He was in the process of conquering everything in his path: Persia, Egypt, the known boundaries of the world, with a combination of military genius, personal courage, and the remarkable capacity to inspire loyalty in the men who served under him. He had heard of Diogenes, as everyone in the Greek world had. The philosopher who lived in a jar, who insulted the powerful to their faces, who claimed to need nothing and appeared to mean it, was too extraordinary a figure to ignore even for a man conquering the world. The king sought out the philosopher where he was lying in the sun. The most powerful man alive stood before the man who owned nothing. Alexander said, "Ask me for anything you want." The offer was an expression of generosity in the terms that Alexander understood generosity, the offering of access to the resources of a conqueror, the things that most people most wanted: wealth, position, protection, honor, the opportunity to be associated with greatness. It was also, whether Alexander intended it this way or not, a philosophical test. This was the moment of maximum pressure on the cynical claim that nothing conventionally valuable was genuinely desirable. If Diogenes had any secret desire for the things he publicly scorned, this was the moment it would reveal itself. Diogenes replied, "Stand out of my sunlight." The simplicity of the reply is its greatness. He did not ask for wealth because he did not want wealth. He did not ask for a position because he did not want a position. He did not ask for protection because he did not need protection. He did not ask for anything that only a conqueror could provide, because there was nothing that only a conqueror could provide that he actually wanted. The one thing he wanted in that moment was the thing Alexander was taking from him, simply by standing there: the undisturbed enjoyment of the warmth and light of the sun. And the sun, unlike wealth, unlike position, unlike the favor of the powerful, was freely available to everyone. It could not be given by a king because it was not a king's to give. The only service the most powerful man in the world could do for Diogenes was to remove himself from between the philosopher and what the philosopher wanted. The philosophical point is devastating in its precision. Alexander's power, the power that had conquered nations and would conquer more, was of no use to Diogenes because Diogenes' desires were natural rather than conventional. Natural desires can be satisfied without power. Conventional desires cannot. The king was enormously powerful at satisfying conventional desires and entirely powerless to satisfy the one natural desire that Diogenes actually had at that moment. The encounter demonstrates in a single memorable image the entire philosophical argument that the self-sufficient person who has reduced their desires to the genuinely natural is more powerful in the sense that matters most than the conqueror who commands armies, because the self-sufficient person's desires are satisfiable while the conqueror's are not. Alexander, according to the story, was genuinely impressed rather than insulted. He reportedly said that if he were not Alexander, he would wish to be Diogenes. This statement, whoever actually said it or invented it, encodes a real philosophical recognition. Alexander had everything that conventional life aspired to and was still, in the philosophical sense, enslaved. Enslaved to the perpetual need for more conquest, more territory, more proof of greatness. Diogenes had nothing that conventional life valued and was genuinely free. The king could recognize freedom even if the costs of achieving it were ones he was not prepared to pay, and not, given his responsibilities and his character, prepared to consider paying. The Alexander encounter matters philosophically because it dramatizes the central cynical claim at maximum intensity. The claim is not merely that simple living is pleasant, or that wealth is not as satisfying as people expect. The claim is that genuine freedom and the capacity for genuine happiness are inversely related to dependence on conventional goods. The more you need, the more your well-being depends on the continued availability of things that fortune controls. The less free you are and the less capable of genuine happiness. The person who needs nothing from fortune is maximally free. And this freedom is not an abstraction. It is visible, demonstrable, embodied in a man lying in the sun, entirely undisturbed by the presence of the most powerful person in the world, asking only that the shadow be removed from between him and what he genuinely wanted. Part 9. The question of pleasure, against both indulgence and unnecessary denial. One of the most important and most frequently misunderstood aspects of Diogenes' philosophy is his attitude toward pleasure, and getting it right is essential for understanding both the internal coherence of his philosophy and its relationship to the other schools, particularly Epicureanism, that were wrestling with the same questions at roughly the same historical moment. He is often described as an ascetic, a philosopher who rejected pleasure and embraced suffering as a path to virtue. This description is misleading in a way that distorts everything downstream of it. Diogenes was not opposed to pleasure. He was opposed to specific kinds of pleasure-seeking, the kinds that create artificial needs, generate dependence on fortune and on other people, and thereby undermine the autarky that he regarded as the precondition of genuine freedom and genuine happiness. The distinction matters enormously. His was not a philosophy of self-denial for its own sake. It was a philosophy of discriminating carefully between the pleasures that serve genuine human flourishing and the pleasures that undermine it. The framework he used to make this discrimination was, characteristically, the nature/convention distinction. Natural and necessary pleasures, eating when hungry, drinking when thirsty, resting when tired, feeling warmth when cold, experiencing physical movement and exercise, should be embraced without apology, without pretense, without the elaborate social rituals that Greek culture had developed to manage and display these pleasures appropriately. These pleasures are what the body actually needs. Satisfying them is part of living in accordance with nature, and there is nothing genuinely shameful or philosophically suspect about doing so. The elaboration and socialization of these pleasures, the transformation of eating into a socially managed performance of status and refinement, the transformation of sexuality into a complex field of social meaning and obligation, is a conventional overlay that adds anxiety without adding genuine satisfaction. Natural but unnecessary pleasures, good food when it is available, pleasant company, beauty in its various forms, are not to be pursued at significant cost or with significant anxiety, but there is equally no virtue in refusing them if they come without cost. The cynic who performs poverty as a social role, who refuses pleasures that are freely available in order to maintain the appearance of austerity, has misunderstood the philosophy entirely. The point is not the performance of self-denial, but the genuine reduction of artificial need. If a pleasurable thing is available without cost, without compromise, without the creation of dependency, there is no reason to refuse it. Diogenes was not trying to be miserable, he was trying to be free. Only the unnatural pleasures, the pleasures of social status and the admiration it brings, the pleasure of being flattered and deferred to, the pleasure of accumulating wealth beyond genuine need, the pleasure of power over others, are to be avoided systematically, because these are the pleasures that create the most dangerous artificial needs. They are genuinely satisfying to the humans who pursue them. Diogenes was not naive enough to claim they were not. But their satisfaction reinforces the dependence they create, and that dependence is the source of the deepest unfreedom. The person who has once experienced the pleasure of being greatly admired needs admiration in a way they did not before. The person who has lived surrounded by luxury finds simple living genuinely difficult. The person who has exercised power over others becomes, over time, genuinely unable to function without it. These pleasures are addictive in the precise sense. They create, through their satisfaction, an intensified version of the need they temporarily satisfy. This nuanced account of pleasure connects to a broader argument about the relationship between pleasure, dependence, and freedom. Diogenes' claim was that the pleasures available to the person who has achieved autarky, the sunlight, the simple food, the good conversation, the satisfaction of natural bodily needs, the pleasure of honest perception unfiltered by social anxiety, are not inferior to the elaborate pleasures available to the wealthy and the powerful. They are, in several important senses, superior. They are available without cost, and therefore without the anxiety of maintenance. They cannot be taken away by fortune and therefore generate no fear of loss. They do not create artificial needs and therefore do not produce the cycle of satisfied craving and renewed desire that characterizes the pursuit of conventional pleasures. They are, in the most precise sense, satisfying. They actually satisfy. The desires they address, rather than temporarily quieting desires that are guaranteed to return in intensified form. There is a specific and important argument embedded here about the phenomenology of desire. The conventional understanding of pleasure treats it as the satisfaction of desire. You want something, you get it, you feel the pleasure of having what you wanted. This understanding, applied to conventional goods, tends toward an escalating cycle in which each satisfaction raises the baseline of expectation and thereby increases the intensity of desire for the next satisfaction. The person who starts with modest pleasures and acquires more elaborate ones does not end up happier. They end up with more elaborate desires whose satisfaction requires more elaborate effort, and the anxiety of that effort is itself a source of suffering that partially or fully cancels the pleasure of satisfaction. Diogenes was describing this cycle with great precision and offering the only reliable escape from it, the reduction of desire to its genuinely natural level, at which it can be satisfied reliably and cheaply and without the anxiety of insatiable escalation. Part 10. Diogenes and Women. Complexity in the Radical Tradition. Any serious engagement with Diogenes must address his attitudes toward women, which were, like almost everything about him, complex, internally inconsistent, and considerably more interesting than a simple dismissal or a simple celebration would allow. The Cynic tradition had an unusual relationship with gender norms for the ancient world, one that deserves careful and honest examination, precisely because it reveals both the radical potential of the nature/convention argument and the limits that even radical philosophers encounter when their arguments come up against the deepest assumptions of their culture. On the progressive side, the Cynics were among the very few philosophical schools of the ancient world that explicitly welcomed women as practitioners of philosophy in their own right, rather than merely as companions or students of male philosophers. Hipparchia of Maronea is the most important example. She was a woman of good family who, after encountering the philosophy of Crates, who was Diogenes' most devoted student, found it sufficiently compelling to give up the conventional life of marriage, household management, and social respectability that her position offered her, and to adopt the Cynic lifestyle in full. She wore the philosopher's cloak, travelled and lived as a philosopher rather than as a wife, argued publicly with sophists in the Agora, and is reported to have defended her choices with philosophical arguments rather than apologies when confronted with social criticism. She was, by all accounts, regarded by Cynics and by many observers as a genuine philosopher, not a curiosity or a philosophical groupie. This is remarkable for the ancient world. Women's participation in public philosophical and intellectual life was essentially nil in 4th century Athens. Plato's Academy is sometimes cited as an exception. There are reports of female students. But even there, the participation of women was exceptional rather than normative. The Cynic tradition, by contrast, seems to have been genuinely open to female participation, and the reason is clearly traceable to the philosophical commitments of the tradition itself. The nature/convention argument applied to gender just as clearly as it applied to class, to ethnicity, to civic status. If the distinctions that matter are those of virtue and reason, and if women are capable of virtue and reason, then the conventions that restricted women to the domestic sphere had no more natural justification than the conventions that restricted philosophical inquiry to the wealthy or to the native-born. Diogenes himself is reported to have argued explicitly for the equal education and equal physical training of women, for the abolition of the conventions that made female public life impossible or disreputable, and for treating women as capable of the same philosophical achievement as men. Whether he actually said all of these things in precisely these forms is uncertain. The sources are unreliable, and the tradition of reporting his sayings was highly creative. But they follow so naturally from his stated principles that there is no reason to doubt that they reflect his actual philosophical commitments. The complications arise when you look at some of the other reports about Diogenes' attitudes toward women, which include comments of a crudeness that reduces women to their bodily functions and treats female sexuality as an object of contempt rather than as the natural capacity of a rational being. The tension between the theoretical egalitarianism implicit in the cynical argument and the cultural misogyny that even the most radical philosopher of the ancient world absorbed from his environment is real, and should be acknowledged without either papering over it or using it to dismiss the genuine progressive dimension of the tradition. What the Cynic tradition on gender demonstrates, in the end, is that philosophical principles are not self-applying. Having the right principles does not guarantee that you will apply them consistently. The principle that conventions are arbitrary and virtue is the only genuine distinction worth making should have pointed directly and immediately toward the equal status of women in philosophical and public life. It did point there, partially and inconsistently. Hipparchia apparently applied the argument more consistently than Diogenes himself did, and in doing so, she made his philosophy more itself than he had managed to make it. That is one of the ways philosophical traditions grow, by people taking the principles more seriously than the person who articulated them was prepared to. Part 11. Death and Indifference. The philosopher's final lesson. Diogenes' attitude toward death was, characteristically, a demonstration rather than merely an argument. He faced the prospect of his own death with a combination of philosophical equanimity, deliberate provocation, and genuine intellectual engagement that exemplifies the Cynic practice at its most extreme and its most philosophically serious. The philosophical problem of death is one of the oldest and most urgent in the tradition, and it divides into several distinct questions. There is the question of what death actually is, what happens to the person who dies, whether the self persists in any form beyond physical dissolution. There is the question of whether death is an evil for the person who dies, whether it deprives the dying person of something genuinely good, or whether, if there is no experience after death, there is no deprivation. And there is the question of how a person should relate to their own mortality, whether fear of death is rational, whether equanimity in the face of death is achievable and desirable, and what the relationship between how you face death and how you have lived actually is. Diogenes was most interested in the second and third questions, and his answers were characteristically direct. Death is not an evil for the person who dies, because the person who dies ceases to exist as an experiencing subject, and something that does not exist cannot be harmed by any condition, including the condition of non-existence. This argument, later developed by Epicurus into one of the most carefully argued positions in ancient philosophy, was for Diogenes less a philosophical conclusion than a live demonstration. He demonstrated his acceptance of it through his instructions about the disposal of his body after death, instructions that were designed simultaneously to make a philosophical point and to shock the social sensibilities of people who had not thought carefully about what those sensibilities were actually for. He reportedly said that he should be thrown outside the city walls and left unburied, or thrown in a ditch, or fed to the wild animals. These instructions violated the deepest social and religious norms of ancient Greek culture, in which proper burial was not merely a social nicety, but a religious obligation whose failure could damn the soul of the deceased. When asked whether he was not troubled by the thought of lying unburied, he replied that it made no difference to him, since he would be dead. When pressed about what would happen to his body if birds and beasts tore at it, he said, "Then put a stick nearby so I can drive them away." When his interlocutor pointed out that he would be dead, and therefore unable to perceive or do anything, Diogenes replied, "Exactly my point. The argument is deployed with perfect economy. The interlocutor's concern about what happens to the body after death presupposes that the dead person will be in some condition to be affected by what happens to their body. Diogenes' reply exposes this presupposition as inconsistent. If you acknowledge that he will be dead, and therefore unable to perceive or act, then you have already acknowledged that nothing that happens to his body after death can affect him. The elaborate conventions surrounding burial and bodily integrity after death are conventions maintained by and for the living, not by or for the dead. They express the living's anxiety about death and their desire to maintain the fiction of the dead person's continued presence and continued personhood. Stripping away that fiction, performing the indifference to one's own corpse that intellectual honesty about death requires, was, for Diogenes, the final philosophical act, the completion of the demonstration that began with his first rejection of conventional goods. The fear of death was, for Diogenes, one of the most powerful and most unjustified forms of suffering that the failure to think clearly about nature and convention produced. Most people fear death as if it were an experience they will have, as if dying is something that happens to you in a way that will be terrible to undergo and terrible to persist in afterward. but dying is the end of experience, not a form of experience. The condition of being dead is not a condition that will be experienced by the person who is dead. The fear of death, therefore, is the fear of a condition that will not be experienced by the person who fears it. This does not mean that thinking about death cannot be painful in advance. It means that the pain is generated by a mistake, by treating the non-existence of experience as if it were a kind of experience, by imagining oneself as a subject of the condition one will be in, when in fact there will be no subject. He was willing to think about his own death in the most direct and least sentimental terms, and to demand that those around him do the same. When someone asked him how he wanted to die, he said he wanted to die as he had lived, simply without pretense, in full possession of his philosophical clarity. He did not want a beautiful death in the literary sense, a death that made a good story, a death that would be remembered as suitably heroic or suitably philosophical. He wanted a death that was continuous with the life he had lived, unsentimental, clear-eyed, without the conventional softening devices that the living use to make death more bearable for themselves, and that in so doing perpetuate the confusion about what death actually is. The actual circumstances of his death are predictably disputed by sources that were not reliable to begin with. One account says he died from eating a raw octopus, in characteristic defiance of the convention of cooking food. Another says he died from a dog bite, with the symbolic resonance of a philosopher who had embraced the dog as his philosophical emblem, dying by the wound of one. A third says he simply chose to stop breathing, holding his breath until he died. The last account is almost certainly legendary, but it is the most philosophically coherent with the life he had lived. It describes a death chosen freely, on his own terms, the final exercise of the autarky he had cultivated throughout his life. Even natural necessity would not have him accept on terms he had decided to accept. Part 12. The Cynic Tradition, from Diogenes to the Stoics. Diogenes did not simply leave behind a set of philosophical positions to be evaluated by later thinkers in the detached way that one evaluates the positions of a dead philosopher. He left behind a way of life that attracted genuine followers, generated a living tradition with its own teachers and students and practices, and eventually flowed into one of the most influential and most enduring philosophical schools in the ancient world. The Cynic tradition that he created is philosophically important, not just as the source of Stoicism, though that would be sufficient to make it historically significant, but as a distinctive philosophical practice that represents a genuinely different vision of what philosophy is and what it is for. His most devoted student was Crates of Thebes, a wealthy Boeotian aristocrat who encountered Diogenes' teaching, found it compelling enough to take seriously, and eventually found it compelling enough to actually live. Crates gave away his considerable fortune, the sources differ on the amount, but it was substantial, and adopted the Cynic lifestyle with a conviction that seems, by all accounts, to have been genuine rather than performed. He did not, like many later admirers of philosophical poverty, keep a comfortable house in reserve. He actually gave everything away and actually lived as Diogenes had lived, with the philosopher's cloak and the jar, and the public philosophical engagement and the rejection of conventional social standing. Crates was by temperament a gentler and more socially warm figure than Diogenes. He was known for humour that was more affectionate than cutting, for a philosophical style that was more inviting than confrontational, for a willingness to engage with people where they were, rather than demanding that they come to him. He was, by many accounts, beloved in Athens in a way that Diogenes was not, precisely because he lacked Diogenes' capacity for devastating rudeness. But he maintained the essential features of the Cynic philosophical practice: the voluntary poverty, the public philosophical engagement, the rejection of conventional social hierarchy, and above all, the demonstration that the good life was available without the things that conventional wisdom insisted were necessary for it. Crates was the teacher of Zeno of Citium, a Phoenician merchant who came to Athens, encountered Cynic philosophy, and spent years in serious philosophical engagement with the tradition before developing his own systematic philosophy. Zeno founded Stoicism, and through Stoicism, the core philosophical claims of cynicism, that virtue is the only genuine good, that external things are morally indifferent, that the wise person is genuinely free regardless of external circumstances, became the philosophical common sense of educated Romans for centuries. The Stoic school produced, in Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, some of the most practically influential philosophical writing in Western history, and every one of them was developing ideas whose ultimate source was the man living in the jar in Athens. But the relationship between cynicism and Stoicism is more complicated than simple inheritance, and the complications are philosophically revealing. Stoicism took the philosophical conclusions of cynicism and embedded them in a systematic metaphysics, a detailed account of natural law, a positive political philosophy, and a social ethics that made them compatible with conventional civic life. The Stoic sage pursues virtue as the only genuine good, but does so while participating in public life, maintaining family relationships, fulfilling professional obligations, and living in material comfort if fortune provides it. The external indifference is internal, a matter of philosophical orientation rather than of actual material simplicity. Diogenes would have recognized this as a philosophical retreat, a domestication of the radical insight that stripped it of the most important part of its content. The claim that external things are genuinely indifferent is easy to make in comfort. It is difficult to be certain of until you have actually tried living without them. The cynical practice of actually living without conventional goods was not an optional addition to the philosophy, a lifestyle choice that some people might make and others might not. It was the philosophical demonstration, the empirical test, the only way to be genuinely certain that the indifference was real rather than performed. By separating the philosophical conclusion from the practice that demonstrated and tested it, Stoicism made the conclusion easier to hold but harder to be certain of. The cynical practice was philosophically demanding in a way that Stoicism was not, and that demanding character was not incidental to the philosophy but essential to it. Part 13. The Critics: What Diogenes Got Wrong. No serious engagement with Diogenes can avoid the serious criticisms his philosophy has attracted from serious philosophers who have examined it carefully. He was not infallible. His arguments have real gaps. His applications were sometimes inconsistent with his principles. And several of his core ideas have been challenged in ways that deserve genuine responses rather than dismissal. The most fundamental criticism targets the nature/convention distinction on which everything in his philosophy rests. Diogenes treats this distinction as sharp, clear, and stable. On one side, the genuinely natural, which is good and should be followed. On the other side, the merely conventional, which is arbitrary and should be examined critically and probably discarded. But the distinction is much harder to maintain than this simple picture suggests, and the difficulty is not a minor technical problem, but a challenge to the foundations of the entire philosophical edifice. Human beings are naturally social animals. Aristotle made this point directly against the cynical position, and it has lost none of its force in the intervening millennia. The capacity for language, the capacity for political organization, the capacity for the kinds of deep personal relationships that require social contexts for their development and expression, these are natural human capacities. They are not conventional additions to a pre-social natural human core. They are constitutive of what human beings naturally are, and these capacities, being natural, require social contexts, including social conventions, for their exercise. You cannot have language without the conventions that constitute a shared linguistic practice. You cannot have friendship without the conventions that give social relationships their meaning and stability. You cannot have political life without the conventions that constitute law, property, and civic membership. If social conventions are the necessary medium for the expression of natural human capacities, then the sharp distinction between the natural and the conventional breaks down in exactly the cases where it is most needed. The conventions Diogenes dismissed as arbitrary are the conditions under which natural human flourishing is possible. A life without them is not more natural. It is less developed, less fully human, in precisely the sense that the exercise of distinctively human capacities, reason, language, political life, deep relationships, requires the social scaffolding that conventions provide. This is Aristotle's argument, and it is genuinely powerful. It does not, however, establish that every convention is therefore justified. What it establishes is that the nature/convention distinction cannot be used as a simple critical tool, natural good, conventional suspect, without a much more nuanced account of which conventions serve genuine human flourishing and which ones obstruct it. Some conventions are necessary conditions for the exercise of natural human capacities. Others are arbitrary, serving the interests of the powerful or the inertia of custom, rather than any genuinely human good. The philosophical work is to distinguish between these kinds, and Diogenes' simple dichotomy is not adequate to that task. A related criticism concerns his account of freedom. The freedom he cultivated and demonstrated was freedom from dependence, from conventional need, from the goodwill of others. This is a genuine and important form of freedom, and Diogenes' demonstration of it was philosophically valuable. But critics have consistently noted that freedom from is not the only important kind of freedom, and may not be the most important kind. There is also freedom for the freedom to develop your capacities, to pursue projects across time, to build things and relationships and understandings that require stable conditions and sustained engagement. This kind of freedom requires exactly the material and social conditions that Diogenes' autarky excluded. The person who owns nothing, depends on nobody, and is attached to nothing, has maximized freedom from at the expense of freedom for. Whether that trade is wise depends on what you think human flourishing actually requires. The practice of shamelessness has attracted a specific philosophical objection that goes beyond mere social discomfort. The argument that everything natural can be done without shame rests on the premise that the only morally relevant distinction is between natural and conventional, with natural being good and conventional being suspect. But this premise is too simple. Shame can track something morally important, even when it attaches to things that are, in some sense, natural. The capacity for cruelty is natural. Human beings are capable of deliberate cruelty without cultural instruction. But cruelty is also genuinely shameful. The natural/conventional distinction does not map onto the morally significant/morally insignificant distinction with the precision Diogenes assumed. Some conventions track genuine moral truths. The fact that something is conventional does not establish that it is arbitrary, and the fact that something is natural does not establish that it is beyond moral evaluation. The poverty of Diogenes' constructive political philosophy is also a genuine weakness that his critics have always noted. His critical philosophy was brilliant and devastating. But when it came to the question of how society should be organized, he had almost nothing to offer except the minimum: abolish money, abolish marriage conventions, abolish the distinctions of class and civic membership. What the resulting society would look like, how it would feed itself, govern itself, resolve conflicts, educate its children, care for its sick and old, he did not address. A philosophy that can tell you what is wrong with existing arrangements, but cannot tell you what better arrangements would look like, is philosophically incomplete in an important sense. It is a powerful instrument of critique, but not a guide for construction. Part 14. The influence on Rome, Stoicism, satire, and the examined life. When Greek philosophy moved to Rome, it moved in large part through the tradition that Diogenes had initiated, and through the Roman engagement with that tradition, Diogenes' core philosophical insights shaped some of the most enduring writing in Western intellectual history. Seneca, writing from the dangerous proximity of Nero's court in the 1st century CE, returned repeatedly to the figure of Diogenes as an example and a provocation. Seneca was himself a man of enormous wealth, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, in fact, who professed philosophical principles that seemed to sit uncomfortably with his material circumstances. His critics, both ancient and modern, have found the gap between his Stoic principles and his luxurious practice deeply suspicious. But the figure of Diogenes that appears throughout Seneca's letters is not a comfortable one, and the discomfort is philosophically productive. Seneca holds Diogenes up as the purest realization of the philosophical ideal. The person for whom inner and outer life were perfectly continuous, for whom the claim that external things were indifferent was not a philosophical position maintained in comfortable detachment from its implications, but a lived reality demonstrated in every aspect of daily existence. The contrast Seneca draws, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, between the Cynic ideal and the Stoic compromise is one of the most honest moments in his philosophical writing. He was a man who knew that he was not living up to his own principles, and the figure of Diogenes, who had lived up to much more demanding principles with apparent cheerfulness, served as a constant philosophical irritant, a reminder that the domesticated Stoic version of philosophical freedom was not the only available version, and probably not the most philosophically serious one. Epictetus, who had himself been a slave and who knew from direct experience what it meant to be at the mercy of another's will, saw in Diogenes a demonstration of the most important philosophical claim, that genuine freedom is internal, not external. The slave who has genuinely understood that external things cannot harm what is genuinely his capacity for reason, his will, his philosophical orientation, is freer than the master who is enslaved to his appetites and his fears. Diogenes was the most compelling historical exemplar of this claim. He had had nothing that fortune could take, and he had been, by all accounts, genuinely free. Epictetus was teaching the same insight under very different conditions, to people who had social positions to protect and comfortable lives to maintain, and the figure of Diogenes served as the standard against which every comfortable philosophical compromise had to be measured. Marcus Aurelius represents the most poignant engagement with the Cynic tradition in Roman philosophical culture. He was emperor of Rome, the most powerful man in the world in his time, and he spent his private hours writing philosophical meditations that were saturated with Stoic thought, and behind the Stoic thought, with the cynical question that Stoicism had never quite answered: whether genuine philosophical freedom was compatible with the life of the powerful, or whether the cynic had been right, that genuine freedom required the actual abandonment of everything that fortune controlled. Marcus never resolved this question to his own satisfaction, and the Meditations can be read as an extended attempt to live within the tension it created, to be the philosopher king while knowing that Diogenes would have regarded the very ambition of philosopher kingship as a philosophical failure. The satirical tradition that Diogenes helped initiate had a long and productive life in Roman letters. Lucian of Samosata, writing in the 2nd century CE, produced some of the most brilliant satirical dialogues in the ancient world, and Diogenes appears throughout them as a philosophical hero, the person who saw through pretension with perfect clarity, who asked the devastating obvious question that everyone else was too socially embedded to ask, who was capable of the philosophical honesty that social life systematically discourages. Lucian's Diogenes is a literary character as much as a historical philosopher. but the literary character is philosophically serious. He embodies the cynical practice of using humor and provocation to force genuine philosophical engagement with questions that comfortable people would rather avoid. Part 15. Diogenes and Modernity. The philosopher who keeps returning. Diogenes died more than 2,300 years ago, and he has not stayed dead in any philosophically meaningful sense. He keeps returning in every era and in every culture that has encountered his story, as a figure whose questions and whose example refuse to become merely historical. The man in the jar asking what you actually need has proven to be one of the most renewable figures in the history of philosophy, precisely because the question he was asking does not have a historical answer that settles it once and for all. It has to be answered again, by every person, in every era, against the specific forms that artificial need takes in their particular context. The existentialist tradition found in Diogenes one of its most important ancient precursors. Sartre's analysis of bad faith, the self-deception by which people deny their freedom, treating themselves as determined by their roles, their positions, their social identities, in order to escape the anxiety of genuine choice, is a sophisticated philosophical elaboration of the essentially cynical observation that most people live in systematic self-deception about what they are and what they want. The person who says, "I am a soldier" or "I am a waiter," and uses this social identity to explain and justify their behavior as if the identity were a natural necessity rather than a chosen role, is doing exactly what Diogenes was pointing at when he defaced the currency of conventional values. They are treating the conventional as if it were natural, the chosen as if it were given, the performance as if it were reality. The contemporary minimalism movement engages with a deeply cynical question, even when it is entirely unaware of doing so. Its central practice, the deliberate examination of what you actually need, the reduction of possessions to the genuinely useful, the questioning of the accumulation that consumer culture treats as natural and inevitable, is Diogenes' practice transplanted into a context he could not have imagined, a context in which the capacity for generating artificial needs has been developed into the most sophisticated and comprehensive system of desire creation in human history. The advertising industry, the fashion industry, the technology industry, all of these are, in their cynical analysis, elaborate mechanisms for creating conventional needs where no natural needs exist, for persuading people that they cannot live well without things that bear no relationship to anything their nature actually requires. Diogenes' question, which of your needs are genuinely natural, has never been more urgent than in a consumer culture whose entire economic logic depends on the answer remaining obscure. The philosophy of effective altruism, in some of its more radical forms, recapitulates the cynical logic. If the good life requires much less than wealthy people typically consume, and if the excess could be redirected to meeting the genuine needs of people who currently lack what nature actually requires, then the accumulation of wealth beyond genuine need is not just philosophically mistaken, but morally wrong. This is a very cynical argument in its structure, even if effective altruists do not typically present it as such. The identification of the minimum sufficient for genuine flourishing, and the critique of consumption beyond that minimum, is the nature/convention argument applied to the specific circumstances of contemporary global inequality. Part 16. The Complete Vision, Integration and Application. Diogenes' philosophy, assembled from the fragments of his practice and the stories of his encounters and the tradition he initiated, forms a coherent and powerful whole, even without the systematic architecture of Platonic or Aristotelian philosophy. Its coherence is the coherence of a life lived according to consistent principles, rather than the coherence of a formal, logical system. And its application to contemporary life is, if anything, more pressing than it was in Athens in the 4th century BCE. because the mechanisms of artificial need creation and social conformity that he was attacking have grown enormously more sophisticated and more powerful in the intervening centuries. The first and most fundamental application of cynical philosophy to contemporary life is the practice of genuinely examining your needs, not accepting them as given, not treating them as natural, simply because they are familiar and because everyone around you shares them, but genuinely and honestly asking, which of the things I feel I need do I actually need, in the sense that their absence would genuinely damage my capacity for happiness and flourishing? And which of them are artificial constructions, desires that were installed in me by social pressure, advertising, the comparisons I make with others, or the simple inertia of having always had them? This examination is genuinely uncomfortable, because the answer is almost always that a significant portion of what you feel you need is artificial rather than natural. And acknowledging this creates an obligation, or at least a philosophical pressure, to actually change the way you live. The discomfort of that pressure is precisely why most people do not engage in the examination seriously. The second application is the practice of honest speech, proportioned to what you actually see and think, rather than to what social management requires you to say. Diogenes told people what he thought about them, regardless of their power or status, because he had eliminated the dependencies that made dishonesty strategically rational. Most people cannot eliminate those dependencies entirely, and should not try, given the genuine value of the relationships and commitments that create them. But the cynical practice of honestly examining which of your silences and distortions are genuinely justified by the value of what they protect, and which are merely habitual social management, is available to everyone and is philosophically essential. The third application is what might be called the practice of norm examination. The deliberate, systematic questioning of the social conventions you follow, not in order to violate them all, but in order to understand which of them you are following for genuinely good reasons and which you are following, because the cost of not following them, the social disapproval, the awkwardness, the loss of belonging, is something you have not been willing to bear. Some conventions survive this examination because they genuinely serve human flourishing. Others turn out, on examination, to be arbitrary impositions that you have been observing for no better reason than that everyone else observes them, and that departing from them would attract notice. The cynical practice is to follow the former and to stop performing the latter, at whatever social cost that decision carries. The fourth application is the cosmopolitan practice of encountering each person as a person rather than as a representative of their group, their class, their nationality, their political affiliation, or their social role. This is harder than it sounds in a world of intense tribal division and political polarization, where the mechanisms for sorting people into categories and generating emotional responses to the categories, rather than to the persons, have become extraordinarily sophisticated and pervasive. Cynical practice requires deliberately resisting these mechanisms, not naively, not by pretending that group membership is irrelevant to people's circumstances and perspectives, but by consistently trying to see past the categorical representation to the actual person beneath it. The fifth application is the philosophical use of whatever setbacks, losses, and reversals fortune brings you, the cynical practice of treating deprivation as an opportunity for philosophical discovery rather than merely as a misfortune to be survived. Diogenes did not choose exile. He discovered in exile something that changed his understanding of what was genuinely valuable. This does not mean that loss is always good or that deprivation is something to be sought. It means that the experience of doing without something you thought you needed, and discovering that the deprivation was more survivable than you expected, is philosophically valuable in a way that no amount of argument can replicate. Every person has experiences of this kind available to them, if they are willing to engage with them philosophically, rather than simply trying to restore the lost condition as quickly as possible. The sixth application is the practice of finding genuine satisfaction in what is freely available. Sunlight, the pleasure of clear thinking. Good conversation with people who are willing to be honest. The satisfaction of natural bodily needs without elaborate social performance surrounding them. The enjoyment of physical movement and the pleasures of the body's natural capacities. These things are available to almost everyone at almost no cost, under almost any conditions. They are not inferior to the expensive pleasures that consumer culture celebrates as the marks of the good life. They are, on the cynical analysis, superior. More reliable, more directly satisfying, less corrupted by the anxiety of maintenance and the fear of loss that expensive pleasures generate. The seventh and final application is the one that unifies all the others. Intellectual honesty about your own life. Diogenes' lamp, searching for an honest man, was directed at other people. But the cynical practice requires that the same lamp be directed at yourself first and most consistently. Which of your stated values do you actually live by? Where does the gap between what you profess to believe and how you actually live most urgently need philosophical attention? What are you carrying that you could put down? What are you performing that serves no genuine purpose? What would your life look like if it were shaped by your genuine values and your genuine needs, rather than by the accumulated weight of social expectation and conventional habit? These are not comfortable questions. They were never meant to be. They are the questions that the philosopher with nothing to lose asks the people who have protected themselves from asking them. They are the light of the lamp in broad daylight. Conclusion: the courage to live without pretense. We began with a man living in a jar, telling the most powerful person in the world to stand out of his sunlight. We end with a question. What do you do with this philosophy? How do you take Diogenes' radical, demanding, cheerfully provocative vision and use it to live and think better in the specific circumstances of your actual life? The answer begins with honesty about what you are actually doing when you follow the conventions of your social world. You are not following nature. You are not following reason. You are following agreement. The accumulated expectations of people who had their own reasons, many of them not traceable to anything important, for deciding that things should be done this way. Some of these agreements serve genuine purposes. Many of them are simply the residue of historical accidents, power arrangements, and the self-interest of people who benefited from having them observed. The cynical practice is to tell the difference, not abstractly but concretely and honestly, in the specific context of your own life and the specific conventions you are actually following. This requires a kind of courage that is rarer than physical courage and more demanding than intellectual courage in the ordinary sense. Physical courage is the willingness to risk bodily harm in the service of something important. Intellectual courage is the willingness to follow an argument to a conclusion that challenges your prior commitments. The courage that Diogenes exemplified was something beyond both. The willingness to risk the actual social consequences of living according to your genuine philosophical convictions, rather than simply holding those convictions in private while living a socially conventional life in public. Most people who find cynical philosophy interesting find it interesting as an idea and continue to live in ways shaped primarily by social expectation rather than philosophical conviction. This gap between theoretical assent and practical commitment was precisely what Diogenes' lamp was looking for. But the courage does not have to be Diogenes' extreme version to be philosophically genuine. The version of cynical practice available to most people in most circumstances is not the courage to throw everything away and live in a jar. It is something more modest and more sustainable. The courage to examine honestly which of the things you are pursuing are genuinely important and which are performances you have been trained to give. The courage to tell the truth to people who need to hear it, even when the telling carries a social cost. The courage to reduce your dependence on conventional goods incrementally and to discover, in the reduction, whether the things you feared losing were actually as important as your fear suggested. The courage to follow the nature/convention argument wherever it actually leads in your specific life, rather than stopping it conveniently before it reaches anything you are not prepared to change. Diogenes would say that most people live in a kind of voluntary imprisonment. The walls are not physical, they are made of social expectation, of the fear of disapproval, of the anxiety of departing from what everyone around you treats as normal and necessary. These walls feel real because departing from them is genuinely uncomfortable. But discomfort is not the same as harm, and the discomfort of departing from convention is almost always considerably less severe than the anxiety of maintaining the performance indefinitely. The person who has tested the walls, who has actually departed from a convention they had been observing out of habit and found that the social consequences were survivable, knows something that the person who has never tested them cannot know. They know that the walls are thinner than they look. The lamp that Diogenes carried through the streets in broad daylight, searching for an honest man, was also a challenge addressed to everyone he encountered. It was asking, "Are you honest enough to examine your own life with this kind of light? Are you willing to see which parts of it are genuinely yours, and which are performances you have been giving for so long that you have forgotten they are performances? Are you willing to find out how much of what you carry could be put down without genuine loss?" Diogenes' philosophy is not a comfortable philosophy. It was never meant to be. It is a philosophy of maximum honesty about minimum necessity, of radical freedom from artificial needs and artificial fears. Not everyone can or should take it to its logical extreme. The cynic life as Diogenes lived, it was not available to most people, and is not the only expression of the philosophical insights it embodies. But everyone can take from it the practice of asking, with genuine seriousness and genuine willingness to act on the answer, what they actually need, what they actually value, and what they are doing that serves nothing except the perpetuation of a performance that has long since lost any audience worth performing for. The man in the jar had found what he was looking for. He was not searching for more. He was looking at the rest of us, with our enormous and anxious accumulations of things and status and approval and social performance, with something that looked remarkably like pity and somewhat like amusement and, if you looked carefully, a great deal like genuine philosophical concern. The concern of a philosopher who had done the arithmetic and found the result startling, that the life most people were working so hard to maintain was costing them the very thing they were working to achieve. The invitation he extended is still open. Come, examine what you actually need. Come, speak honestly to people who need to hear the truth. Come, practice finding satisfaction in what is freely available. Come, look at the conventions you are following and ask which ones serve genuine human flourishing and which ones serve only themselves. Come, be willing to be thought strange in service of being genuinely free. Come, carry your own lamp and be honest about what you see when you shine it on yourself. Diogenes lived freely so that we could learn what freedom actually costs and what it is actually worth. The lesson is waiting in the sunlight, outside the jar. The question is whether we are willing to get up and look.